Hello, my name is Michael Parker, and welcome to episode 10 of Antidote. Today we're going to be discussing Freemasonry in the 21st century. How is it still relevant, and why is it still viewed with some suspicion by some? Meanwhile, it's gaining popularity with others. Our guest today is Robert W. Sullivan IV. He is the writer of this book, The Royal Arch of Enoch. Robert, welcome to Antidote.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me on Antidote. It's much appreciated. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you here. I want to jump off. We're going to have plenty of time to talk about Freemasonry, but first of all, I have to ask you, I know that you're coming to us from Baltimore. That's where you live. And given the events of this past week, were you impacted by that in any way?
No, other than there was certain areas in the curfew you couldn't go out or things like that. But no, myself personally, I was impacted in the fact that I'm a Baltimorean,
right.
And certainly the curfew, and there was, areas you had to avoid and you had to take more caution. It's an unfortunate turn of events, and it's certainly understandable. But it seems the worst seems to have passed, at least for the time being. But myself personally, I can't say I was directly impacted by what had happened.
Right. The reason I'm asking is because I was thinking about you, I was thinking about the city of Baltimore, and I was here for the Los Angeles riots, and it just kind of went through my mind. This may seem a bit odd, but roll with me. I was kind of thinking, well, you know what, Robert is a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and the Freemasons, the Masons, are men of influence and importance, and certainly have an invested sense with their community. I was kind of wondering, and maybe you can't tell me this, but I was just wondering at some point, let's say theoretically, the unrest had continued in Baltimore, and Baltimore, like DC, has some Masonic buildings and symbols encoded into it. I just wonder at what point would Freemasons and Masons band together, not as vigilantes, but do you guys ever talk about this type of thing, like acting in defense of your city and your symbols?
No, I think we kind of leave that to the National Guard.
Understood.
The areas that were affected, what was on TV was by and large, what I would describe as, not the inner city or anything like that, not the tourist area. Certainly they marched down to City Hall, but unfortunately a lot of the violence occurred in not the downtown area. It's still unfortunate, of course, but the attitude was, the general attitude was that once the National Guard had been called in and the curfew had been put in effect, that really sort of quelled the situation. And right now, like I said, things seem to be somewhat getting back to normal. But like I said, it's understandable what had happened. It's unfortunate, but understandable.
Right, I get it. Now, I was just curious. It was just something that went through my mind because, people always, you guys get a lot of bad rap about, what are the Masons up to? What are they really up to? Are they trying to run the world, this, that, and the other? So I'm thinking, well, on the other hand, they are invested in their community. I was just thinking out loud. Let's move along to the book, The Royal Arch of Enoch. This is quite the tome. You and I have spoken in the past, and there's a lot of material that we could go through in here. But one of the things that's most interesting to me about Freemasonry is this entire idea of an astrotheology and the resurrected sun man and things of that nature. And I think that people outside, if you're not a Freemason, you're not a Mason, or you're not a conspiratorial type, you have no clue about this type of stuff. Explain to us kind of what this astrotheology and solar religion is.
Right. That's a good question. It's a long answer. I'll do my best to I'll do my best to condense it. You really do in Blue Lodge Freemasonry, and just to give a bit of a background, you will find this going on in both in the Blue Lodge degrees and in the higher degrees, where you have a lot of astrotheological symbolism. And what I mean by that is, take the 3rd degree Blue Lodge ritual, for example, where the candidate portrays this fictitious man named Hiram Abiff, who is completing Solomon's temple, There are a couple Hirims in the Bible, but by and large, it's a composite character. He's finishing the temple. He possesses the secret word, which is the name of God. And again, this document much more in the book, and just a shameless plug real quick. There's the book. I know you've got a copy. You said you were holding up. But at any rate, Hiram Abiff is completing the temple. And he has the secret name, which all knowledge basically stems from. It's the secret word it's called the lost word of a master mason. And I'll tell you why it's lost in a minute. The temple's being finished, and 3 fellow crafts want the word. Hiram Abiff won't give it up, and he is killed by these 3 fellow crafts. And he's buried west of the temple. And it'll make a long story short, his body is ultimately resurrected. What a lot of people will say is this is a sort of a parody of Christianity, where you have the person being killed, resurrected, being brought from darkness to light. And you will see parallels with Christianity with this, but you got to go one step further with it and say, well, what's that the parody of, or what's that the parallel of, or what's that echoing? And it's of course the oldest of them all, the oldest theology of them all, which is the astral theology or astrotheology, where and it's really, it's the same thing. It's the Osirian cycle in Egypt, where the Hiram Abiff character is the resurrected sun man. It's the murder of the sun. And of course, he's buried west of the temple once he's murdered, symbolizing the setting sun. Solomon dispatches 12 fellow crafts to look for him. Of course, in Christianity, this is the 12 apostles. In Judaism, this is the 12 tribes of Egypt. These are the 12 houses of the zodiac, is what this is symbolizing. And they ultimately find Hiram Abiff's body, and they resurrect him on 3 tries by something called the strong grip of a lion's paw, which is a reference to the constellation Leo the Lion, which is the soul house of the sun. So you will find these very deep astral solar references going on in the Blue Lodge. I mean, even with the way the temple, with the way a Masonic lodge is laid out, you have the worshipful master in the east as the rising sun, the junior warden in the south as the sun at midday or meridian, and then the senior warden in the west as the setting sun. So you have these very deep solar, iconography going on in the Blue Lodge. But then, within this ritual, which I was just talking about, it's really the retelling. I mean, you'll see the paralleling with, the echoing of Christianity, but it's really the Osirian cycle in Egypt, where it's Osiris is killed and resurrected by the secret word that his virgin wife possessed, named Isis. She possessed the secret name of God, the secret name of an Egyptian sun god named Amun-Re, and it was through this word that she was able to resurrect Osiris and sire or birth Horus, who was Osiris's solar stand-in. Mm-hmm. And this is echoed in the Blue Lodge ritual, where the candidate, as Osiris, once he's being brought back to life, is greeted upon what's called the 5 points of fellowship. Of course, if you read people like Albert Pike and Manly P. Hall, you will know the 5 points form a pentagram. And that is a clear reference to this Egyptian dog star Sirius, which was the star of Isis in the Egyptian religion. So you have this very deep Sirius-Isis nexus. And the reason the 5 points are formed, it's a nexus. It's a reference to Isis possessing the secret word, which she used to resurrect Osiris. That's why the candidate is resurrected on 5 points, symbolizing Isis, Sirius in the Blue Lodge. But then he has a substitute word whispered in his ear. The word is lost in the Blue Lodge, and it's not recovered until this higher degree known as the Royal Arch of Enoch ceremonial. It's part of the high degree system. So this is sort of the resurrected sun man, and of course, the idea is that the Masonic candidate now brought to life is sort of this resurrected solar man. He's had his Gnostic epiphany. His divine spark has been ignited inside of him, and can go out and affect positive change in the community. You probably have heard the term within Freemason, and regarding Freemasons, that Freemasons are sons of the widow, or the widow's sons. The widow that is being referred to is Isis, is this virgin mother who is widowed upon the death of Osiris. And again, what it's identifying is that that Masons are all symbolically Horuses, or Hori, I guess would be the proper term. And of course, the Virgin Mother only births the sun; she never births the moon. This is why only men can become Freemasons. So you in Blue Lodge Freemasonry, you will have this very deep astrotheological solar allegory going on, and it's carried forward in the high degree ceremonial. And if I really go into it much more in the book, but it's really part of the key to unlocking a lot of the symbolism going on inside Freemasonry, and it's being carried forward into modern society.
Understood. And the symbol of the sun Sirius and Venus, those are your primary astronomical symbols in Freemasonry.
Well, you have Sirius as this Egyptian dog star. Not so much Venus. I dispel that.
Okay.
The whole thing with Venus. This is constantly being mistaken. You will hear in a couple of Masonic monitors that the term the morning star is being used. The morning star that they are talking about is the sun. That's the giant bright yellow orb up in the sky, SUN. That's what they're referring to. Venus is more properly known as the son of the morning star. And the reason for that is because Venus often occasionally rose in the east, heralding the coming sunrise, but as a false beacon. It's not the true sun. It was known as the son of the morning. And as a false sun, it's often associates with Lucifer. I mean, I know you kind of wanted to ask me about that, and I'll back off the question. I'll back off my answer if you want to just go into that a little bit with Albert Pike. But really, within Freemasonry, I mean, I talk about this. It's really the first part of the book. Is really the premier icon within Freemasonry is the sun. It's all over the place.
And the sun is a powerful symbol in many religions and cultures, which gets me to this point where I wonder, you and I have discussed this before, we talk about people like Joseph Campbell, we talk about Carl Jung. The power of symbols seems to permeate our very kind of spiritual DNA, if it were. And the sun, you see it not only in Masonic imagery, but in papal imagery, and yes, it is. It's a very powerful symbol. And then we start looking at people who've carried on that tradition, the Son of God, Christ.
Oh, of course. Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you will find numerous, solar and astrological themes in the Bible. I mean, it's one controversial argument. We talked about the Masonic ritual echoing Christianity, but then you have to answer yourself, ask yourself, what's Christianity echoing? I mean, it's the sun, it's astrotheology, where Jesus, is the resurrected Savior, the light, the light of the world, the sun.
Right.
You have, the sun being assisted on its annual journey by 12 houses of the zodiac, Jesus with the 12 apostles, death and resurrection. Of course, all the Christian holidays are centered around the sun. The Christmas is, of course, the winter solstice. And the vernal equinox is Easter or Passover in Judaism. And you will find numerous solar and astrological themes going on inside the Bible, both the Old and New Testament. Really, what it has to do with is this idea of solar ages, or a solar age based on the precessional cycle of the sun, where the sun remains in one astrological house for 2,100 years approximately. And of course, in the last 2,100 years, it's been the age of Pisces the fish. So you have Jesus as the Piscean sun god. This is why Jesus feeds his followers with 2 fishes, walks on the water, washes people's feet. This is all emblems of the sign of Pisces. Then, of course, you go before that, you have the age of Aries the ram. And of course, this is Judaism with Moses growing the ram's horns of Aries and all the fire adoration in Judaism, leading the Jewish people out with being protected by the fire pillars. And I get much more into it in the book. I mean, of course, Aries is the fire sign and Pisces is the water sign. And you always find Jesus surrounded by fish and water in the New Testament, just as you always find in Judaism, Abraham slaughtering the lamb. And things like that in the shofar, the ram's horn in Judaism. So you always find these Aries the ram icons in Judaism. And then, of course, in the Bible, you get the next stage up, which is Aquarius. And you actually have that reference directly in the Bible, in the New Testament, when Jesus, as the Son, is asked, I think it's Luke 22:10. He says, when Pisces is over, what house will you enter into next after you leave the house of Pisces? And Jesus says, I will enter into the house of the man bearing the pitcher of water, Aquarius. So you'll even find it directly in the Bible. And I mean, you have Jesus talking about, his followers being children of light, children of the sun. I mean, even in the book of Revelation, Jesus identifies himself as the sun. He says, I am the bright morning star of David. So, I mean, this is nothing new in the Bible. You will find, I think it's one of the astrological keys to unlocking the Bible. And I document this in the book. Really, I believe this is probably why the Book of Enoch was left out of the Bible, is because the Book of Enoch is really the astrological solar key lunar key that unlocks the New Testament and the Old Testament. You will have much more of a better understanding of the astrological allegory going on inside the Bible once the Book of Enoch has been digested. And you're right. I mean, and it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of your show, Mike. This is completely echoed and mirrored in Blue Lodge and high degree Freemasonry. This is irrefutable.
And the Blue Lodge is the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry. After that, you can go to Scottish Rite Masonry or York Rite. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you are a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Freemason.
Yes, correct. Once you do the Blue Lodge, which is degrees 1, 2, and 3, that's entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, you can opt to go into 1 or 2 or both or neither of the high degree bodies. And in the United States, the 2 premier high degree bodies are the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. You can do both, you can do neither. It's completely up to the individual Mason.
Well, what I found interesting is as a Mason, you are required to have a belief in a supreme being. Who that is not necessarily an issue unless you're going York Rite. Is that correct?
To an extent, what you say is true. In the Blue Lodge, when you join a Blue Lodge, they'll ask you, do you believe in God? And that's where it starts and that's where it stops. If your answer is yes, you don't have a problem. Whether you call this God, Allah, whether you call him the God of Abraham, whether you call this God Yahweh, whatever, or Jehovah, that's up to you. It's as long as you have a belief in a supreme being. You can't be atheist and you can't be agnostic. And agnostic is, I'm not sure. You have to believe in a supreme being. After you complete the Blue Lodge, you can do either the York or Scottish Rite. The reason why most Masons tend towards the Scottish Rite is if you do the York Rite ends. The final body of the York Rite is the Knights Templar. And that requires, in order to become a Knights Templar, you have to pledge allegiance to Jesus Christ. It is only open to Christian Freemasons. So if you're a Blue Lodge Freemason and you are a Muslim or a Hindu or Jewish, the York Rite probably isn't going to appeal to you not as much as the Scottish Rite would, assuming you even wanted to go into the high degrees. Again, it's completely optional. I will say this, and it's rare, but it seems to be more of a jurisdictional thing. And I have found it, but it really seems to be an exception, not the rule, where you'll meet someone who is Jewish and joins the York Rite, and they go through it and they just stop at the Knights Templar. They just won't go any further. They do the cryptic rite and they just go through the York Rite, but they won't join the Knights Templar. Most Masons, myself included, kind of see that as if you're going to join a high degree body, you got to finish it entirely. But so for me, if you're going to join the York Rite, you got to go all the way through it and join the Knights Templar. And again, since the Knight Templar is Christian Freemasonry, again, if you're Jewish or not Christian, I suppose it'd be the easiest way for me to say it. It's probably not going to appeal to you. Where in the Scottish Rite, no such requirement is required.
Understood. And another thing that I've learned from our discussions is that this 33rd degree, which is much talked about, that's actually not something that you can strive towards. It has to be bestowed upon you. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right, Mike. When you join the Scottish Rite, you will be able to progress up to the 32nd, no problem. Once you hit the 32nd, that's really the end of it. The only way you can become a 33rd degree is by invitation. You cannot solicit it. You just have to be invited to it. And there's different requirements or different fulfillments that they can solicit they can send out an invite to you based on numerous things, community involvement, sometimes political status, celebrity status, to be honest with you, can factor in. So, I mean, they can just, it's up to them, and it's completely honorary, and it cannot be solicited. You cannot petition the 33rd degree to become it. They have to offer it to you.
Got it. Well, I'm not a Mason, so I only started really looking into the whole Masonic world, in the last couple of years, and I've learned a lot from your books, and you have been very honest on some touchy subjects, which I commend you for. And of course, so we have to talk about the L word. We have to talk about the whole Luciferian thing. So, because that is the primary thing that you hear on the net from the conspiracy world, is that you guys are a Luciferian type organization. So explain how that whole idea came about and what the truth of the matter is.
Right. I guess when it comes to Lucifer, I'm your huckleberry. No, no, I don't have a problem talking about it. The truth of the matter is, I mean, don't get me wrong, I do not hold myself out as a Luciferian, and I don't think Freemasonry, by and large, is Luciferian. But if you define Luciferianism, it really has nothing to do with devil worship. It's the adoration of wisdom, esoteric wisdom. That's really all it is. It filters into Freemasonry through a book initially by a man named, a book written by a man named Albert Pike, and who he is often credited quite incorrectly with you'll hear this in the conspiracy world, that Albert Pike is the founder of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and this is Illuminati Freemasonry. The Scottish Rite is the Illuminati branch of Freemasonry, and the 33rd degree. This is, in order to join the Illuminati, you have to be Albert Pike and join the Scottish Rite. I cannot tell you how false this is. For starters, the Scottish Rite isn't even founded until 1801 by a man named Frederick Dalcho. Pike isn't even born until 1808 or 1809. So someone needs to explain to me how Albert Pike is founding the Scottish Rite 8 or 9 years before he's even born. Right. That being said, he's an important character. He becomes the Grand Sovereign Commander in 1859 of the Scottish Rite. He is a 33rd. It's a position he holds to his death in 1891. In 1871, he writes a book called Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite, which is by and large a book about comparative religion more than it is about Freemasonry. The book borrows heavily. In fact, in some places it's plagiarized all but verbatim from the works of a French Freemason and transcendentalist magician named Eliphas Levi. But in this book, Pike compares the planet Venus to Lucifer. And what he says is it Lucifer that bears the light? Doubt it not. And what he's meaning, all he is saying is, in other words, he says, is it Venus that's heralding the coming sunrise? Doubt it not. And of course, if you use the word Venus instead of Lucifer, this would have been long forgotten and no one would have talked about it. But of course, Pike, he's a Copperhead. He's from Boston, Massachusetts. He fought for the Confederacy, and he has, like myself, the P.T. Barnum gene in him. And he wanted to write something that was going to be remembered. And, he incorporates this and it sets off a furor. People think that it's devil worship and this and that. And, like you mentioned, Luciferianism, it is nothing. All he is doing is comparing the planet Venus to Lucifer. The reason, let me just explain, the reason why that nexus is forged between Venus and Lucifer is because Venus, in the morning sky, in the eastern sky, Venus often rises prematurely before the sunrise. So it's false light. It's not the real light. It's negative false light, and Venus is a negative planet. So it's identified with Lucifer, and of course, Lucifer as a demonic entity comes from the world of John Milton, Paradise Lost. So you can blame some of this on John Milton. Then you have another Freemason named Manly P. Hall, who writes a book called The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, and he talks about that when a man becomes a Freemason, he has the seething energies of Lucifer at his disposal. And essentially, he's saying the same thing, all but a little bit more controversial. All he's talking about is that when a man becomes a Luciferian, when a man becomes a Freemason, I'm sure all the conspiracy world will just say, oh, look, he just almost gave it away. No, what Paul's talking about is when a man becomes a Freemason, he's sort of imbued with esoteric wisdom, and he has solar energy at his disposal. And of course, we've gone into how the Blue Lodge is just a reflection of the sun. And of course, it's the same thing. I mean, Lucifer is the light bearer. The sun is the light of the world. This is where you get things like wisdom, being enlightened from. So what Hall is really talking about is that, that when you become a Mason, solar energy and esoteric wisdom, he's using the term Luciferianism as basically a double meaning to mean esoteric wisdom, is at your disposal. And I kind of agree with him. I really don't think it's too far of a stretch. But again, Hall is like Pike and like myself, a bit of a showman. And want to be remembered. And I talk about Lucifer, of course, in the Royal Arch of Enoch. I talk about it. I talk about Lucifer a couple times. But again, it has. I can tell you, being involved with Freemasonry for going on 18 years, it has absolutely nothing to do with devil worship or Satanism or anything like that. I've been involved with the Blue Lodge for 18 years and the Scottish Rite going on, good grief, 16, 17 years, and I've never seen anything even close to Satanism or evil or demonism or anything like that.
No, I get it. And I just wanted you to clarify that for the folks out there who may not even be aware of this stuff, because it's the first thing that you hear. And
Oh, of course.
There's so much of that material on the internet that it needs to be dispelled with. Let's move on. Well, let's just talk about Albert Pike for just a second.
Sure.
I mean, here's a guy, his shadow is cast over Freemasonry. And as you said, yes, he was a Copperhead. He was from the North. He fought with the South in the Civil War. And he looks like kind of a really heavy character, too. I mean, when you look at him, he looks like a scary guy. But he was a very important person to Freemasonry.
Oh, absolutely. He's from Boston, Massachusetts. He's a Harvard dropout. He becomes Grand Sovereign Commander of the Scottish Rite in 1859 at the outbreak of the American Civil War. He fights for the Confederacy during the Civil War, so we know where his loyalties were. That's irrefutable. He remains Grand Sovereign Commander of the Scottish Rite up until his death in 1891. Up until then, the Scottish Rite was headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina. I want to say in the early 1870s, it moves to Washington, D.C., which is where it is now, the House of the Temple there in D.C. And he's mostly remembered for writing this book called Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite, which, if you read it, and I have, it's really a book about comparative religion. What Pike does is he talks about Blue Lodge Freemasonry, and he talks about the symbols used in Masonry, and then symbols in the high degrees, like he'll say, okay, here's the axe, and then he'll say, in Masonry it means X, Y, and Z. He says, well, then in the Egyptians it meant this, and in the Mysteries of Lucius it meant this, and in Zoroastrian it meant this, and to the Pythagoreans it meant this, and in Kabbalah, it associated with this number and it means this, and he just runs through just all these symbols and meanings and numbers and how they all, then he takes them back, into Masonry, how they're being used, and then traces them back to all these ancient mystery schools and how they were being used in that context. It's really a book about comparative religion. I think it's a great book. Again, it borrows heavily from the works of a man named Elathus Levy. He was a Freemason. He's a magician. Again, he's another source of controversy. Levy is the guy who draws the goat of Mendes drawing, the Baphomet. Yeah. And again, that doesn't go over with a lot of people. But again, that emblem is more Gnostic and dualistic than it is satanic. But again, it doesn't go over well with a lot of people. But yeah, I mean, I when I was writing Royal Arch of Enoch, and I've talked about this, I may even mention on one of your shows, it might have been, Morals and Dogma was one of the books I used as a template, as a basis to base Royal Arch of Enoch on.
Mm-hmm. Well, another thing that I was curious about is much ado is made about the fact that Washington, D.C. has streets laid out with certain symbolism. But when I'm reading your book, I mean, it's much more than that. It's much more than just Masonic symbolism that is being portrayed there. And that's not the only city in which this type of thing occurs. I mean, you've got symbols in Baltimore, you've got symbols, I believe, in Detroit. So this is not strictly something that only happened in Washington, D.C.
No. You'll find it a lot in D.C. because it's your federal district. And of course, the whole idea of this new federal district in the New World comes from this Neoplatonic novella called The City of the Sun,
yes.
Written by a Dominican friar named Tomosa Campanella. That's probably the most salient utopic reference for the federal district. But you're absolutely correct, Mike. You will find this Masonic symbolism in Baltimore, Maryland. You will find it in Erie, with the construction of the Erie Canal. New York as the Masonic Empire State. You will find it with Union College. You will find it on the state seal of California, Texas, Pennsylvania. There's a reason why that is the Keystone State. That deals with Royal Arch Freemasonry. And of course, in the federal district, the two elected branches of government, the Senate and the House, and the executive, the chief executive, which is, for lack of a better word, within Freemasonry, is nothing more than a Royal Arch Sun priest, is connected by Pennsylvania Avenue. And of course, Pennsylvania is the Keystone State that comes straight out of Royal Arch Freemasonry. I get into that much more in detail in the book as to why Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct, Mike. I mean, if you read the Royal Arch of Enoch, and I know you have, I mean, I have a whole chapter in there called The United States of Freemasonry, which I document that the United States of America, for lack of a better word, is the world's first Masonic republic. Yes. And I think the evidence for this is, to be honest, overwhelming. I
think that's clear. And I also, and we've kind of touched on this before, but personally, I don't mind that somebody had their hand on the wheel early on. I don't mind so much that this was influenced by Masonic ideas, because at that time, those were the great thinkers that were among us. And the Freemasonic club or association was a way for great thinkers to get together and to come up with ideas. So certainly not all of these men were Masons, but some of them were, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they let this influence some of their ideas about how to govern and how to set up cities. And then you also put forth the idea that, I believe it was Lully, this idea that buildings should have a sense of reverence and inspire the people of that city to be patriotic towards their city. So it all kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. When you get into the founders of this country, the best way for me to answer this and kind of dovetail off what you're saying is, I mean, I agree with you, is, it was the sort of thing, they knew what they didn't want. They knew they didn't want monarchy, and they knew they didn't want a Vatican-type organization where one man's religion might be sacrificed on the altar of another man's or woman's. So they knew what they didn't want. So I mean, here we have a lot of the founders, were Masons. I mean, here you have this vast system of morality and symbols that these guys really drew off of, and they drew off it, and they saw this as a very positive thing. Like you said, ideas coming, Enlightenment ideas coming out of the Renaissance, carried forward in the Enlightenment, and now we're being transferred into concrete form in this new world, in this new enlightened world. We're not going to have monarchy. We're not going to have royalty. We're not going to have, what's the word I'm looking for?
Taxation without representation.
Things
of that nature.
Hierarchy. Yeah. Dukes, nobility, anything like that. We're going to have where each citizen is going to be, equal to the mother, unto another. Everyone was going to be equal, and a government of laws, not men, essentially. So that's really, and they saw Freemasonry as this great treasure trove of symbol and moralities that they basically created a country around. And this is clearly going on with the founding, and it's carried forward in the early 19th century by a man named DeWitt Clinton. And he is really the mastermind behind all this. And then you get into, but again, the negativity towards it is, Mike, is that there was no transparency done. It was just done, and people see these Masonic buildings and this Masonic architecture, 200 plus years later, and they think it's evidence of this vast overarching demonic conspiracy, when it's just the opposite. It's just symbols, Masonic symbols symbolizing this new world enlightenment, which is coming out of Freemasonry. But then you get into the whole thing with the astral architecture and the sacred architecture. And again, you're absolutely right. Again, people see this, these alignments to certain star systems and constellations and the solstices and the equinox. I mean, I don't know how it ever got this rap, that this stuff is demonic or satanic, or that this is Illuminati demonism. I mean, this is all total nonsense. This comes from the world. I mean, it's really what it is. It's a form of mystical Christianity. I mean, you're absolutely right, Mike. It comes from one of the early thinkers on this was a Renaissance Kabbalist named Raymond Lully, who talked about in his writings that architecture, sacred architecture, should incorporate these divine ratios, things like, Phi, the Vesica Pisces. Again, this is not evil. This is divinity. And it's the same thing when you incorporate astrology or stars or planets and alignments. The idea was, since the stars and the planets are closer to God, you're imbuing the building with a sense of divinity. Again, it has nothing to do with devil worship or demonism. I mean, that is so ridiculous. When I hear some of these podcasts and videos that, the Washington Monument is this satanic, evil obelisk, because it's the total opposite. It's supposed to be drawing on the stars, which are closer to God. It's actually a form of It's actually, to be honest, a form of Christianity, but granted, it's a mystical form of Christianity. And again, his work, Lully, you'll find this carried forward in the works of a Dominican friar named Giordano Bruno. And again, this is, it comes out, it's Hermeticism. I mean, it's as above, so below. It's the Hermetic maxim of Hermes Trismegistus. So, it's nothing evil, but again, people want to look at it since there was no transparency to it. People seem to think that it's this evil overarching conspiracy when, these guys who are behind it, Latrobe, Robert Mills, Washington, who was a surveyor. I mean, these guys would be doing somersaults in their graves if they heard some of this stuff.
I get it. Well, I know we're going to have to wrap this up, but on the upside, before we get out of here, Freemasonry and the interest in Masonic matters has never been larger, I don't think. I mean, you guys are really on the upswing right now. And so, I mean, you still have your critics, but it seems like you guys are enjoying a resurgence in popularity and probably growing membership.
Oh yeah, I mean the critics have been there since day one, Mike.
Yeah.
I mean, and they'll be there 200 years from now. But yeah, I mean, I would definitely say to you that there definitely seems to be a resurgence in Freemasonry. I would definitely say this is coming out of the birth of the internet since the late 1990s, early 2000s, where people are much are becoming much more familiar, younger people, with people like Manly P. Hall, and really the more esoteric side of the craft. And again, this comes from the work of Dan Brown, although I can't say I'm his biggest fan, but things like the National Treasure movies, where when I joined the Masonic Lodge in 1997, and again, this is really still pre-internet, when I joined, the reason for joining, what motivated most people for joining from the mid-19th century up until modern times, was for charity work or to carry on a family tradition, which for me was both. I come from a long line of Maryland Freemasons, and of course I would like to be active in the community as well. But of late, I would definitely say with the millennials, there is definitely a much more interest. I mean, and this has been documented. This has been documented in Masonic surveys, so I know I'm not making any of this up. That there has definitely been this resurgence in Freemasonry, and it's a renewed interest in the esoteric, symbols of Freemasonry and sort of this esoteric side of the craft, both in the Blue Lodge and high degrees, where these rituals really do have these deep. Where the candidate, and I spent 20 years writing the book. You discovered that these rituals have these very deep symbolic meanings that if people find very interesting. At least I do, and you can really unlock a lot of. I really do believe in some instances that a lot of these rituals do contain a lot of hidden truths about the world, and it's just unlocking them. And once the person does that, they'll find out a treasure trove of information is now available to them. So yes, I would say that Freemasonry is definitely becoming more back in vogue, and it's basically because of an interest in the esoteric side of the craft.
I think that's a good thing, and I think that when people start asking questions and wanting to expand their consciousness and spirituality, I think it's a good thing. And this is, I mean, after quite a drought, you've even said it with yourself, that there have been Masons in the past that you thought were not, they went through the rituals, but they were not aware of what all of the symbology meant. And so now that's coming around, and people are beginning to look back into that.
Oh, I agree with you. A lot of this comes from the William Morgan affair of the mid-1820s.
Yeah.
And I'll just go real quick. It was a very controversial thing. This was really the crux of anti-Freemasonry. A man was killed in Batavia, New York, for allegedly exposing or threatening to expose Masonic secrets. There's a kangaroo court. Masonry really came under attack. And what Masonry did to survive it distanced itself from the esoteric, where Masonry just emerged as, hey, we're a fraternal order that does charity work and helps widows and orphans. And it was really this sentiment that carried Masonry through the 19th century and through most of the 20th century. So if you were a Mason and you joined in the 1950s or 1960s, you would never have been exposed, by and large, to any sort of esoteric, mystical side of the craft. Maybe 1 out of every 100 Mason may have been exposed to the works of Albert Pike or someone like that. But really, the millennials coming in, and it's because of the internet and being able to watch videos on Manly P. Hall and Albert Pike, there is definitely this renewed interest in the esoteric side of Freemasonry. Again, I think this is irrefutable.
That's great stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Antidote. Robert W. Sullivan IV is the author of this book, The Royal Arch of Enoch. Please pick it up. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike, for having me on Antidote. It was a great show, and I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, hope you enjoyed this. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to Slip TV and Lip TV 2 on YouTube. Share our videos if you like, and until next week, we are the Antidote.